Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in the Hamilton Mythology Lectures. This is number 6, the Golden Fleece, as well as 4 adventures. Here I'll be lecturing from Edith Hamilton's classic text, Mythology, Part 2. I'm going to be working Chapter 7, the quest of the Golden Fleece, sometimes referred to as Jason and the Argonauts story, as well as Part 2, Chapter 8, 4 great adventures that are just kind of put together in a single chapter. These are really 5 kind of classic stories of adventure, what we will call in this lecture several times the quest motif, the journey motif. We'll come back to it. And in many ways, these stories are kind of the heart of what we think of a lot of times when we think about Greek mythology. Of course, the most famous example of this, obviously, is Homer's Odyssey and Odysseus, right? Now, if you haven't been watching my LearnStrong lectures, I recommend that you go to learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, find the folder that says Hamilton's Mythology. And then in my first lecture, I gave an introduction. In my second lecture, I gave kind of a brief explication of the major gods, goddesses. In lecture 3, I talked about the Demeter, Dionysius gods. And then in lecture 4, I did the cosmogonic myths, as well as the earliest known heroes. And then in lecture 5, I did 9 different stories that Hamilton will discuss of lovers. Now we turn in lecture 6 to the beginning of what we're going to see now for several lectures, these adventure stories, okay? And they're very, very popular in Greek mythology, and obviously they have lots and lots of cadences and kind of carry over into all kinds of texts of the Western tradition. We'll get into that later. Now again, my suggestion here is what I have given to you before. I do recommend that you annotate this work on your own, get your own copy of Hamilton's Mythology, read it, do your own work at the 3 levels of reading. What does the text say? Level 1, what does the text mean? Level 2, we subdivided 2A, themes, messages, and 2B, rhetoric, not what's said, but how it's said by the author. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this text? At 3A, how do I relate to other texts? And then finally at 3B, how to relate to myself? And that, of course, is important because our learning theory will always challenge us to connect new information to old information, again, in meaningful ways, as we've said. Now, let's turn to the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Now, there's lots of versions of this story. Now, I'll be working with Edith Hamilton's, and she, of course, is going to provide us with the majority of the major points of the story. But you can do your, and I hope you will, do your own research to kind of find out more about this story. We're going to study, as we said already, this notion of the journey motif and why it's so central to Western thought. We'll come back to this idea. At level 2B, though, I want this in your notes right away, so put this in your notes. I want us to be looking at 2 things for each of these 5 stories that we'll look at. First of all, I'm very interested in the notion of the symbol of the quest or the journey, right? So we want to study all the different ways that the 5 stories teach the importance of the quest or the journey. And then secondly, I want to ask about what is the primary central conflict in each one of these stories. That is to say, each one of these stories has a lot to do with choices that are made and how we kind of live with those choices. All right, let's go through it quickly. Chapter 7, the quest for the Golden Fleece. This is a long poem, really, actually, by the poet Apollonius of Rhodes, as well as Pindar, and then Euripides will throw in as well some of the end of our story. And again, as we've said before in earlier lectures, you'll have Edith Hamilton kind of summarizing in really brilliant fashion and beautiful, beautiful written prose, kind of summarizing all of the different storylines. Jason, she argues, is the first hero in Europe. This is an interesting idea. I think there's some good argument, good reasons for this argument. It's the great first hero who takes a great journey. This is 1 generation earlier, Hamilton points out, than Odysseus. And I think much of what we see in Odysseus is probably predicated and born in the Jason story. Our story, as many of these stories, will begin with royalty. They begin with a king, a Greek king, Athamas, and he divorces his wife, Nephele, and he marries Ino, who is a princess. She's from the family of Cadmus, king of Thebes. We're going to hear more about that in a subsequent lecture. And Nephele is really worried about her 2 kids, and so her son is Phrasis, and she worries because she knows that Ino is probably going to want to kill the children. There is this element, let's put it in our notes now, we're going to see this a lot in these stories. There is this element, this kind of common element that children often are the victims of just kind of gratuitous slaughter because adults want to get payback or whatever, right? Ino's plan is to kill Phryxus, and the way that she does it is she burns up the corn, and she tells her husband, you need to sacrifice your son because he's responsible. Phryxus and his sister, however, are saved by a ram that flies through the air, and the ram is specifically special because it has this fleece that's made of gold, okay, this golden fleece, and it flies through the air with the help of Hermes. However, the sister, Helle, slips off the ram in the air, falls and drowns, and of course the strait there is called the Sea of Helle, or the Hellespont, of course. Phryxus, however, is saved. He ends up at the land of the Coletians, and these are very fierce people. You have here the king Aeetes, and Aeetes wants him to marry his daughter, and Phryxus will sacrifice the ram that has saved him, and he gives the fleece to Aeetes. Phryxus has an uncle who is king in Greece. His name is Isaone. And Isaone is the nephew to Peleus, and Peleus has taken over the throne. And here we have Aeson's son, Jason, then, is the rightful heir to the kingdom, and he will demand that he have the kingdom back. Again, this is a similar kind of motif. A child shows up, demands some kind of lineage, and then you have some kind of conflict that begins to ensue. He's sent away to grow up, to be protected, if you will, similar to, for example, Zeus being sent away to Crete by his mother. And when Jason is grown, he does come back to claim his throne from Peleus. And Peleus is told, actually, beware of a man who shows up wearing only one sandal. Jason, on his way there, helps this old woman across. It's actually Hera. And in the process, he loses his sandal. Of course, this will freak out Peleus. And this is always kind of fun in these stories. Let's put this in our notes at level 2B. That you always get this very interesting kinds of little nuances within these stories. Beware of a man who shows up in one sandal, which sounds kind of bizarre. When Jason does so, Peleus is obviously freaked out. Peleus will say, I'll give you the kingdom, it's yours, but there has to be a quest. There has to be an accomplishment. There has to be a test. You have to pass the test. And in this case, it's, I want that golden fleece. Your father, Phryxus, demands that I am given this fleece. Jason, and this is significant for our notes because this is what makes him heroic. Let's say it now. Jason will do lots of things that are not very heroic, certainly by today's standards, and we're going to debate that at the end of our story as it relates to the love story with a woman named Medea. However, the thing we want to point out that makes Greek heroes heroic is that they look at challenges and they embrace those challenges. So let's put that in our notes right away. They love the idea. And so Jason loves the idea that he's going to have to go off in search of this golden fleece, and he will bring this fleece back. Hera, we are told, will be helping Jason along the way. Jason's first order of business is to construct his team, his crew. And again, we're already jumping to 3A when we think about the movies that you love that are adventure films where one guy's got to go on some kind of quest or test or something, but he can't do it alone. He's got to have his buddies with him, and those are her buddies with her. And though that team is constructed, and of course that team is usually understood to be superstars. And here, of course, We're going to have an amazing crew. It's going to include Hercules. We're familiar with him. We're going to hear more about him in another lecture. Orpheus, we've already heard of course, the great musician. Castor and Pollux are going to be there. Peleus, Achilles' father, is going to be there. All of these people are all going to be on this, sailing on this ship. The ship is called Argo, and therefore we call it Jason and the Argonauts. Okay, so now let's go through the adventures briefly. We don't have a lot of time, but obviously I'm hoping that you've read this on your own in Mythology. Our first quest experience adventure is at Lemnos, where only women live. All the men have been killed except for the old king, and they decide to help Jason. You got a story left out of mythology, because this is a story that was written for young children, where Jason and the heroes that are with him are all invited to sleep with the women on Lemnos and produce another race of superheroes, if you will, and they're glad to oblige, as you can imagine. We have an interesting second story. Hercules has a friend, or sometimes translated as lover, Hylas. And Hylas is somehow he's taken away, and Hercules goes off in search of him, and that's kind of the end of Hercules' role in this story. We'll have many more stories about Hercules to come. A third interesting story for Jason is the Harpies. Now these are scary kind of flying creatures with sharp beaks and claws, and they leave this loathsome stench any time they've been around. There's this old man on this island that they find, Phineas. I mean, he's kind of cursed by Zeus because he's made Zeus upset. And he's been told that the sons of Boreas will actually save this old man, and that's in fact part of the crew of Jason. And they do save the old man, and also they are saved through the help of this man with these clashing rocks, the Sempliglades, and they use a dove to do it. And so you have the old man is saved by the young men. You can already begin to see some some potential storylines here and motifs that will make points of it 2A, right? Their next adventure is with the Amazons, these warrior women. We should put this in our notes. Several of these stories will mention these Amazonian women, these strong women. And in fact, in our story, Jason just decides to avoid them altogether. He comes to Colchis, the country of the Golden Fleece, and here Hera will ask Aphrodite to help Jason. This is a significant moment for your notes, because Aphrodite says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get Cupid, my son, to make Medea, which is the daughter of the king of Aeetes, to fall in love with Jason. Now, two things about Medea for your notes. One, she's this really kind of interesting, obscure woman who has tremendous gifts that are magic powers. Two, she, Medea, will come to represent the obsessive lover. The woman who will do anything for her man, and we pretty much in our story mean anything, okay? With the help of Cupid, Medea falls for Jason, and she's just crazy blind in love or obsession for her man. King Aeetes asks Jason, what is it that you want? Jason says, I want the Golden Fleece. Aeetes, of course, is upset, and he says, well, you can't have it unless you go through this trial. Now, we should put out for your notes that often when these trials are constructed, they are constructed with the intentionality being that the hero is supposed to die, right? I mean, Aeetes is going to say, yeah, you can have the fleece, but you got to do these things, and the understanding is, of course, that during doing these things, that Jason's going to die, and so we're all set up for the adventure. There's two major ones. The first one is you got to bring together two bulls that are fire-breathing and have bronze feet. In other words, they're like unbelievably strong. And you need to yoke them together, and then you're going to have to plow a field. And then secondly, once the field is plowed, you're going to have these dragon's teeth that you're going to throw into the furrow, and it's going to be like seed corn. Well, what happens, of course, is that out of these dragon teeth up will spring these terrible armed men who, and then you're going to have to kill all of them. It's interesting that Jason is excited to do this, but he realizes he needs help. And the help that he needs is going to come from Medea and her magic. She will help in several ways. Let's list it in our notes. One, Well, she has this magic ointment that she will rub all over over Jason so that he cannot be hurt by the bulls. This ointment comes from the blood of Prometheus. We've talked about Prometheus already. And then she tells Jason, when these men grow up from the dragon's teeth in the middle of all of that, throw a stone into the middle of that, and that will make them all fight against each other and kill each other. And finally, Medea says it, I hope that you will remember me and you will take good care of me. And Jason here begins the promise part of our story. We've heard this before, right? And of course, we will often refer to this as, in the literature, put it in your notes, the Jilted Lover motif. Now this won't take us all the way back to the most famous Jilted Lover story is, of course, Aeneas and Dido. We'll get to that story later in another lecture. But the idea is simple. The guy makes promises to the girl, and the girl believes the guy, and of course the guy, he either can't or he doesn't keep all of his promises. Well, Jason in our story is successful with the bulls, the dragon teeth, the bad guys, and then Medea continues. She points out that now my father wants to kill you. There's this terrible serpent that guards the fleece. Don't worry, I'll lull it to sleep. And Jason says, I promise that I will marry you for all the great things that you are doing for me. Ultimately, you got all kinds of then really tragic stories to follow. The king will send his son, Aphrodite, and this is the brother of Medea, and Medea will actually kill her own brother in defense of her man. There's two different stories here. One is that Jason kills the brother. The other is that Medea herself cuts up her own brother into small pieces. We have a next trial, Scylla and Charybdis. We'll hear more about this when we study the Odyssey. These two terrible monsters, and you've got to try to figure out how to go in between. Hera will tell Jason, follow the sea nymphs, and they will guide you and they will save you. Next they come to Crete, where Medea will help again with this terrible bronze man, this Talus, who's got only one weak spot, which is down by his ankle. That will remind us, of course, of Achilles in a later story, right? The hounds of Hades are called down by Medea, and Talus's ankle is grazed, and ultimately he dies. And then finally they're back to Greece, and the heroes are disbanded, and Jason and Medea will provide the Golden Fleece to Peleus. Peleus then is going to, he is the bad guy. Of course, he forced Jason's father to kill himself, and the mother died of grief. And Jason asks Medea for punishment on Peleus. And the way that Medea does this is fascinating. She shows Peleus' daughters, I can make old men young. And she takes an old ram, she cuts it up into pieces, throws it into the pot, and out of the magic pot jumps a young ram. The young girls say, well, let's do that with father, so that way he can grow young again. And they cut up their father and put him in the pot. You can see this is a very violent story, right? And that, of course, takes care of Peleus. There is one other story here that Medea, a couple actually, that Hamilton points out, that Medea will actually restore Jason's father back to life. And also, there's a story that Medea actually gives Jason the secrets of perpetual youth, right? That fount of eternal youth, those waters of eternal youth that we sometimes come across as a motif in mythology. Here we're going to see it as well. The final part of our story is, of course, the tragic part of our story. And when Euripides tells the story, it is obviously a tragedy. Jason and Medea find their way to Corinth. There they live together, but Jason doesn't marry her and has 2 sons with her. She lives in exile only with Jason, totally in love with Jason. She'll do anything for her man. But Jason decides, for political reasons, that he will marry the daughter of the king of Corinth. And obviously the king of Corinth now is worried that Medea will somehow hurt his daughter, and he wants to send Medea away. Jason will, in fact, say to Medea, it's time for you to leave. I am going to marry this princess. And Jason is going to give all kinds of reasons why this makes good sense. Hamilton will say it this way. This was too much. The torrent of Medea's wrongs burst forth. She says, you come to me of all the race of men, yet it is well you came, for I shall ease the burden of my heart if I can make your baseness manifest. I saved you. Every man in Greece knows that. The bulls, the dragon men, the serpent warder of the fleece, I conquered them. I made you victor. I held the light that saved you, father and home. I left them for a strange country. I overthrew your foes, contrived for Peleus the worst of deaths. Now you forsake me? Where shall I go? Back to my father's house, to Peleus' daughters? I have become for you the enemy of all. Myself, I had no quarrel with them. Oh, I have had in you a loyal husband to be admired of men, an exile now. Oh God, no one to help. I am alone. To continue reading, just because it's beautiful prose, I'll read it. Jason's answer was that he had been saved not by Medea, but by Aphrodite, who had made her fall in love with him, and that she owed him a great deal for bringing her to Greece, a civilized country. Also, that he had done very well for her in letting it be known how she had helped the Argonauts, so that people praised her. If only she could have had some common sense, she would have been glad of his marriage, as such a connection would have been profitable for her and the children too. Her exile was her own fault only. Her stubborn pride is what he will say. Well, you can kind of imagine where this thing's going to devolve to. We'll call this part of our story in the notes here, Medea's revenge, and it is brutal. Medea will take poison, put it on a robe, send Jason's sons with the robe to Jason's new bride. When she puts the robe on, she is consumed in flames. Secondly, Medea's got the problem of her own sons. What am I going to do? I cannot let them live, because to let them live will mean that they grow up as slaves, and then Medea will kill Jason's sons. You can imagine, of course, the final lines of this chapter will read, when Jason came full of fury for what she had done to his bride and determined to kill her, Medea, the two boys were dead, his own sons, and Medea on the roof of the house was stepping into a chariot drawn by dragons. They carried her away through the air out of his sight as he cursed her, never himself, for what had come to pass. Well, this is a story, obviously.